Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out insightsinsound.com for a full list of our podcasts and YouTube series. Insights in Sound is made possible with the support of our friends, OBSBot, Roland, AEA Ribbon Mics, Solid State Logic, Session Wire, Pantheon Media.
Well, welcome all of you. My name is Daniel Lifton-Keller. I'm chair of AES LA and host of the Insights in Sound podcast. And my guests today, from the far side, appropriately enough,
Yes.
Joe Vezzetti.
Good morning, everybody. Far side. Thank you, Art.
From Cherokee Studios, Mr. Bruce Robb. From UCLA by way of Trident Studios, Adam Moseley. And author, musician, historian, and all-around master of all trades, Mr. Brian Kehew. And this is sort of a, I guess we did this once already, but we're going to do it again, and it's probably going to be completely different this time because we're all very much ADD here. So
Last time?
Squirrel. Yeah. But we're here to talk about Trident, and that includes both the consoles and the studio itself that begat the consoles. And so let's first just open up with a little bit about the beginnings of Trident Studios, because this was a particular era, and I think talking a little bit about the era will then sort of influence the creation of the console and that discussion. So Trident Studios began in an era where the entire music industry and recording industry was changing pretty dramatically. We were going from corporate-owned studios and engineers in white smocks to really creating a situation where it was all about the artist, and everything had to do with catering to the artist and taking care of the artist and just creating a more creative space. So Trident Studios more or less was one of the very first studios that really was created with the artist in mind. And Brian, I know you can speak to a lot of that.
One of the things about this new studio, and we're talking the later 60s when it opened up, a good comparison is my reference point, the Beatles is a good reference point for almost anything. They'd been at EMI, which was a corporate-owned studio owned by the label, with Capitol Tower in Hollywood, same kind of deal, RCA in New York, where studios were owned by the label, but they were told to do this, paid for by that. It had a certain function to it, but Trident Studios started in downtown London, a section called Soho, which is a very hip restaurant, a nightclub type place. You wouldn't think of a studio much there, but down this little kind of walkway alley, there is still the building where Trident was, a multi-story complex, if you will, and not huge, but cool, and the idea was a hipper, modern studio, which is what those groups like the Beatles and so forth were looking for. Even dragged Beatles out of their own main studio. We all think of Abbey Road as being cool. They thought it as being old and very fuddy-duddy. So when they experienced Trident, which had the first 8-track machine going on there, and they experienced recording with cool dark lights and very hip kind of place with carpeting and things like that, they weren't used to that, and they thought this is the way to record, which is now what we all do.
And unrestricted hours too. That's another thing. You know, studios like EMI, they really worked in shifts. And you were there for the 4-hour shift or 6-hour shift, whatever it was. And during that time, it was all regulated, and you were relegated to a certain amount of hours that you had to be in and out. And again, that did not really jibe with the creative process. And especially as musicians started getting more and more loose and shall we say, indulging in more and more substances and whatnot, this kind of mentality was really, it didn't quite really work. And so the Beatles in particular were very, very happy to get the hell out of that. And also, this was a studio that embraced new technology. They had the first 8-track machine, which, you're talking about, we famously, most of us know that most of the Beatles recordings were done on 4-track. This was the first time that anybody had seen an 8-track machine. And that in itself really changed the creative process.
It became a very hip studio, and one of the key components was, as with any studio, the people that worked there. So the famous, well-known engineers that are known for Trident is Roy Thomas Baker, Ken Scott, and a guy named Rob and Jeffrey Cable as well. They very strong engineers who put a stamp on the recording business as well as their own records.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of these people really came up in those. Now Ken Scott came up in Abbey Road, and was more or less lured away. But a lot of engineers really came up in the Trident culture, and that in itself really kind of begat a whole new generation of, you talk about RTB, Roy Thomas Baker, he really started out doing things differently than the white coats at Abbey Road, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that particular generation of engineers, that was and that's who we all are in that sense. We're those people who came up in this era of, really caring more about the artist and about creating the music than about, tea time, things like that. So now, Adam, you were not there at the beginning of Trident Studios, but you were there at a very early phase of the studios, and so you were kind of immersed in the culture pretty early on too, right?
Yeah, I started at Trident in 1978, January 12th, to be precise.
A date which will live in infamy.
Yes, it does. So my story is that I had bands, and my bands were crap and I was crap, and I thought, if I moved to London, I was born in Brighton, if I moved to London, I can put a band together, a lot more musicians, put a great band together, become a rock star. Moved to London, went to law school, put a band together, we were still crap. And I thought, okay, so maybe it's not the city I'm in, maybe it's more to do with me, and I need to know how to make records.
Wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah, and from my earliest recollection was always like reading the back of vinyl albums, and producer was the big name. So I thought, well, he must be the guy that knows. So I'll become one of them. So I wrote 100 letters to studios, because you could write to 100 studios back then, or decent ones in London. And I got one reply, which was from a studio I'd never heard of, didn't know anything about it. Trident, went for the interview. Studio manager asked me, why did I write to them? And I said, well, I'm wondering, do you have any jobs going as a producer? I'd like to be one of those. And he laughed, and he said, do you know anything about the studio? I said, no. And he said, well, a few people have done okay from here, And I thought, okay. And he said, but we're enlarging the control room at the moment. Trident had 2 rooms, separate floors. The control room, the tracking room, where the control room was upstairs looking down, and then the next floor up was the mix room. And he said, we're enlarging the control room. I've got 15 people working. I'm effed off buying takeout food. It's too expensive. I see in your letter that you've worked in restaurants, that you can cook, and you've also done construction, which is what I did in my summer holidays. So he said, I'll offer you a job doing construction and cooking. Start at 9 a.m., construction during the day in the control room to make the room big enough to put the A-range in. And then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, come to me, tell me how much petty cash you need to cook for 15 people. There's a 4-ring electric stove on the top floor. I want to cook 3-course meals, cook, serve up, clean up. Then you can go back to construction, 9 a.m. to 3 a.m., 6 days a week, and I'll pay you 20 quid a week, £20 a week. about $27 back then. And I thought, wow,
I get paid?
I get paid, really? I was like, wow, showbiz, didn't quite suit my immigrant grandparents, where, becoming a chef and construction guy in a rock and roll studio and quitting law school, that wasn't quite their plan. But I knew nothing about the studio. And at the time, we were just I was doing all the menial kind of construction stuff. And then as the construction got more and more done, and I was one of maybe 12 people struggling to carry the frame of the A range in. It's so heavy. And then they started putting these long things in with lots of buttons on them. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I thought, I will never understand this. I'm never going to be able to. I'd failed every science at school, everything technical I'd failed. I will never understand this. And seriously, I thought, I've only been out of law school for 6 months. Maybe I can get back in. But as the modules were put in the board, and then as I started to see music happening, and the first session I saw happening was Peter Gabriel 2, the Scratch album. And when I saw the magic of that coming together, and then from being the chef and construction worker, I moved up. I got promoted after 3 months to T-boy, which had been the lowest human form of life, but I actually had to step up to it. And then the typical route was, from T-boy, if you could deliver tea and coffee on time, at the right temperature, to the right people, with or without sugar, not spilling it on the tray, 24 cups in the elevator of 5 stories that had the bounce on each floor was a bit different. If you could manage that, maybe you could manage being on a session. And then as tape op, I became senior tape op, then an assistant engineer, an engineer, started to co-produce and produced. But the guys I learnt from were the guys who created the Trident way. As you say, RTB, whose engineer was Mike Stone, and I worked with Mike Stone for about 3 years. And the first records I was involved in a recording, assistant recording capacity, were the 4 solo Kiss albums, which Mike. So that was my first kind of involved in recording, and my first hands on the console mixing was Rush Permanent Waves. So nothing like in the deep end, nothing too challenging. But yeah, RTB, Ken Scott, Robin Cable, Gus Dudgeon, the Genesis guys, the Elton John guys.
It'd be good to mention the people that owned Trident were brothers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very important
Very
to the
different
story.
from each other.
Yeah.
In that sense. Yes.
Affectionately called the Piranha Brothers. That was the affectionate name for them.
That would be a hint.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone's seen a Guy Ritchie movie, you'll get the kind of vibe. But they were innovators. Barry was an engineer. He'd done one of the engineers on Hey Jude, and always a dispute over which mix was a Ken's mix or Barry's mix. But Barry was more one of us because he was an engineer, and he had more of that awareness and character. And Norman, who wrote a very interesting book.
He was a character.
More managerial, though, and more financially oriented. So he became essentially manager of Queen, who they kind of gave studio time to in the middle of the night. This new band, Queen, that had never recorded, was allowed to record there at night. So the early Queen work was done there. But he also became their manager. And years later, as Queen pulled away from him, they wrote a song called Death on Two Legs about him on the Night at the Opera record.
Absolutely. And although it never named Norman, Norman sued Freddie and they settled out of court, even though, because everyone knew what it was about. And Norman
wrote a memoir called Life on Two Legs.
Life on Two Legs, which was a FU back at the song. But it, as you said, it was very experimental. We were none of us had a clue what we were doing. I don't think anyone came into that studio with any experience. Everyone had just left school, usually early, and just was on a path to get to the door of that studio and get in, and then find out what it was about. I had no idea what I was getting into. I had no idea what was involved, what was required. But the minute I got in there, I just felt this is where I'm meant to be. And I started to see the magic of musicians and the power and the producer and the engineer, and I never looked at the console in a technical way. It was only always for me an emotional way to create turning buttons to create the sound of an emotion, and that's stayed with me for decades. But
And I think that's a nice segue into the console, because the console was created in almost the same sort of haphazard fashion.
Yes.
So essentially they had an engineer there by the name of Malcolm Toff, who was, I believe, employee number 2 or 3, something like that. He got his job by just happening to be at the opening party, and Norman at one point just yelled out, "Anybody want a job?" And Malcolm showed up, and Malcolm had never designed a console either. In fact, as Malcolm explains it, even after he designed this console, they spent another 6 months reverse engineering it so that they could write the documentation.
yes.
Yeah, but the entire science, and I use the term loosely, of designing this console really was the seat of the pants would be a nice way of putting it. And now, one of the very first consoles ended up at Cherokee Studios. And I believe, Bruce, you have a lovely story about auditioning that console.
Want to hear
Do
it?
tell.
Okay. Oh. Yeah, so we got the first Trident day range in the U.S. and we'd been a band for years. I'd been touring since 1960 when I was 13 and moving on forward to that. And when you're on tour, you write all your songs. So the labels we were on said, "Joe, when you get back, we'll give you a budget and go in and cut all these demos." So this goes on when Dunhill was our last label, and they say, "So we've got our own studio now, you can come here and cut." Well, what they'd done is they'd cut the budgets, because we called and said, "Can we come in?" They said, "No, 3 Dogs Night making an album, but in 2 months you can come in." So we built a studio out on our ranch in Chancellorworth, out of our barn. And we started with an Ampex 4-track, which was a step up from the 3-track. But it really became an incredible situation, because we were a band, and we were one of the few bands that actually owned and built studios. And so we were really concerned with what things sounded like, and we had an MCI console for the first one, which sounded good as long as you didn't use anything on it. But it was like that. And so we started auditioning consoles, and Neve sent us beautiful mahogany cases with two rows in them, and we got Helios CADAC API. And we're listening to stuff through them, and we like the API at the moment, because it was the cleanest, most open thing. And there's some consoles that, it's got that warm sound. Well, I'll warm it up myself. I don't like things that color the sound. I want output to sound just like input. So we're going around and we're thinking, why do Harry Nilsson records sound so incredible? They make your stereo more valuable just to play them. And so we thought, Trident, let's call Trident. And we called, and they said, well, we've got our board that's going to be ready pretty soon. And they were kind enough to say, we'll put ours back and send this to you guys. And the difference was unbelievable. We actually ended up putting it in over the holidays. And Rod Stewart had been in first. And then over the holidays, Bowie came in and started his album. When Rod came back, he said, can I hear some Bowie stuff? And we did. And he said, why does it sound like that? He said, well, because we put the Trident Day range in it. And we ended up recutting a bunch of his stuff, because the difference is that knowledgeable, and people tell you that, the sound of it doesn't matter that much. Well, it didn't used to. I mean, old rock and roll was pretty sonically lame. But as groups got better, and particularly as the 60s hit, suddenly, acid rock, folk rock, all of that, you started to hear more acoustic instruments, and the sonics became really important. The Jefferson Airplane, good Lord, that was many great nights listening to that. But when we heard the A range, that made an incredible difference. And people that were coming in, the engineers would always end up saying the same thing, you ruined me. And it's really hard to go to anything else. I know that when we closed Cherokee, I had to go to a few studios that were around, and I had a really tough time going, yow, how am I going to, this is not the same.
How would you describe the characteristics that you were hearing from the A-range mixing board?
It probably had more transient response than anything I've ever heard. And right now, I've got the A-range from Studio One, and that was a board that we got talked into buying and leave for another type of clientele. They said, oh, if you have this, we'll do that. And word around town was something's wrong with Cherokee's Neve VR. And so we called them, and Neve sent 2 engineers over for about 4 or 5 days, went through the whole board, and they said, it's perfect. They said, where are you getting this from? What studios? They said, well, it's Mars. And they said, can we see it? So we took them into Studio One for the A-range. And they're going, oh my. And they said, can we measure this? And he said, well, we're actually getting noise and distortions filled with it up to 90K. I said, what? How did you know that? And they had one of the big Hewlett-Packard things with more knobs on it, nobody could run them. And Toby Foster was our chief engineer, who we've lost, and he was a legend. And they said, we can fix this. And Toby said, don't you touch that. He said, what you're hearing is harmonic distortion. That's the Rosman violin bows. And they said, it doesn't matter that if the records come out and there's not much above 10 or 12K. What you're hearing is the harmonic distortion coming back through. And what that gives you the sound of is you're hearing the room. And when you did that with the A-range, we put that in, I could be driving the car and immediately could tell just from the sound of the room, that's Studio One. It's amazing, and it does so much of your work for you. The board just sounds gorgeous with anything. We're also finding now that we do a fair amount of analog there. I just did an analog session last week. And then I finished an album before that I used Pro Tools on. And I use Pro Tools just for the tracks.
Like a tape?
Like a tape machine.
Yeah. And I had an engineer that said, I know the algorithm for every piece of aux gear you got here, the Pultex, the everything. And he said, I got all of these right here. And I said, no, you got pictures. That's the real thing. And when you go in and put that in, through the Trident, and then on that, channel by channel, bust everything out, no stems, not stems, but no comps, nothing in the box. And we run it through the A-range, and you come out with a different record. It's absolutely amazing sounding. We're just doing something else that it does. We have a system that we used at Cherokee for years, that people would cut things on, and it was actually mostly digital stuff that would sound very crushed and compressed and everything. And it's like, what do we do? And he'd book the room. And our tech staff, and Brown and everybody, had built what we called an ambience retrieval program that you'd use. And we just did an album that came in a heavy metal album that people were mailing their parts in, and ran it through the Tridents, track by track out of the Pro Tools. And we said, wait a minute, you're telling me that's cut on Pro Tools? Not the A-range? And I said, that's going through the A-range and through a whole bunch of other systems that we're using, and the difference is astounding. Just putting anything through the A-range, you go up the steps and you're in a much better place. It takes less to do a record. You find yourself not doubling acoustic guitars to sound gorgeous with one of them.
We talked about 4 studios at your place. You mentioned Studio One, but there are 4 consoles.
We had 4 A-ranges. One of them, that's one of them we took out to put the Neve I just told you about in, and we put it back as soon as we pulled the Neve out. So anyway, what else?
Well, I want to rewind a little bit, because when Trident first, I mean, you were really the first studio in States to get the Trident console. And Brian, you and I have had this conversation before about the way that Trident marketed this, because Trident Studios, before they created the A-range, what did they have in there? Sound Techniques.
Sound Techniques.
Sound Techniques, yeah.
English company from the mid-early 60s that made their own mixing boards. Not popular and not famous until recently because they didn't make many of them.
Right. But at the same time, some very, very famous records were recorded on those Sound Techniques consoles. And the way that Trident marketed, oh, we've got this new console here, and the sound that this is the place where we recorded Pink Floyd and the Beatles and everything. And the irony there was that these consoles were not actually the consoles that were. I mean, it was great marketing on their part.
Well, key to the Trident legacy is that early Elton John records were done there. So Your Song and things like that recorded there. The Bowie records up until about 72, 3.
Yeah, first three.
Are done there as well. So Ziggy Stardust, for example, Hunky Dory, which even sounds better.
Yeah.
Were done there on those Sound Techniques boards, and they are very, very good sounding mixing boards the company's recently relaunched too. So that's part of the legacy, was just that these great sounding records were coming out of Trident, and people that heard them. And again, I've even had tapes come in, just the old 16-track tape. You put it up and you say, wow. Again, in those days, what did we have? We had a microphone into the channel. It's the same channel
transparent.
For the drums, for the vocal. You didn't use different preamps.
Yeah.
You didn't use different EQ. You used what the board had. So the sound of that board in the old days was printed to tape. You could hear the sound of the room and the sound of that console. That's what you were basically hearing. And so when people listen to those very famous records, and there's quite a few, Walk on the Wild Side, early Queen, as I said, some great records, Harry Nilsson, etc., done in Trident.
Yeah, What the Who Pull 2 Works.
Yeah.
Quite a few. So many. Yeah, Genesis.
But not on Trident consoles.
Yeah.
Well, they did at one point transition, even the Bowie changes
yeah.
to being Trident desks. And so it's just one of the things, again, the brothers, and Barry was a very good engineer, made a lot of cool records. They got out there and made this company, which they were calling Triad. We haven't mentioned that before, but Triad is actually the name on the owner's manual, if you see that. Yeah. Triad is their manufacturing company, but also it became a wing of them to do video work. They thought that videos for music would be very important, and guess what? They were right. So when you see early Queen videos, for example, again, Queen handled by them, they were pushing for video component to music in film in those days. And that was what Triad was doing, all these different kinds of things besides we have a recording studio in London. No, we have other concerns, whatever they were, good or bad, concerns, doing things all around town to make things happen.
They out of Triad was Trident Audio Developments, and the consoles were manufactured out at Shepperton Film Studios because the Who owned Shepperton, and the Who's offices were in Soho, right by Trident. So they did a little trade-off, for Trident owned their building, so Trident got space at Shepperton. And then they formed Trillium, which was the video company, and had the first mobile video unit. And they were hired by the BBC to record Match of the Day, the soccer matches, because the BBC didn't have it themselves. And yeah, Norman was so forward-thinking.
Yeah, well, I think probably inspired by that first date where they recorded Hey Jude there. They saw the reach of that, where all of a sudden their studio really went from pretty obscure to world famous almost overnight, because the Beatles recorded Hey Jude there instead of at EMI. Yeah. So again, a lot of great marketing, and marketing is not always honest. I know that may shock some of you.
Really?
Yeah. What? I know. But and I'm always struck by the irony of the fact that really, Trident consoles were hyped on the basis of a lot of recordings that were not recorded on them.
But what came out of it, though, was a great console.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
They might have even said, oh, you like this Elton John record. They did that at Trident, and we have our own console, implying that it was done on their console when the console was equally good sounding. And I think one of the features, well, besides the mic pre, which is very, very special sounding, very, very open would be a good way to put it. Very transients, very extreme low end, but very linear low end, which was kind of unusual. But also the EQ is very special. The A-Range board is kind of different than anything you'll run into out there. And it has 4 bands of EQ, but each band has a fader on it. So you can select a frequency if you want, but then you've got a fader, which engineers are very used to using.
Or the tactical feel of this great.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And you can look at it and see, oh, the low end's pushed, the high end's pulled out. You can look at it visually and see right away.
Well, also sonically, that was the time you were saying music was starting to really catch on to what sonics could do.
Yeah.
People were coming in and saying, we've never sounded like this, we never made a record like this. And it's, the A-Range, there's nothing like it, and I don't know if there ever will be again.
Yeah, I mean, working on that console, and, I cut my teeth at Cherokee and learned almost everything I knew working on those consoles, and then going anywhere else and working on a different console. It wasn't just the sonic experience, it was the tactile experience, because the workflow on those is so unique in that sense.
It was just for all of us coming in knowing nothing about it, and Mike Stone, who ended up doing the 5 Queen albums and the Kiss albums, and then a lot of really great Asia, Heat of the Moment, a lot of great albums. Mike quit school. He was at school with our now King Charles. He quit when he was like 16, made it to London, and turned up at the doors of Trident, became the T-boy. No one knew anything, but that A-Range was so intuitive. It was so easy to look at it and to understand how to manipulate sound. Yeah. And as you said, the first time I went to another studio and was on a different console, my world fell apart. Yeah. Like I had no reference at all. 3K wasn't 3K anymore. 100 hertz wasn't
10K was the one that really hurt.
Yeah, no kidding.
The whole thing was different, and it was like I'd spent my first 4 years on that, and then I went back to Trident in the 80s and put a new team together. But one, it was so intuitive, but also just the sound and the response to the frequencies. It just made sense. And sometimes on other consoles, what it says on the dial, it doesn't, to my ears, still doesn't make sense always. You feel out the other consoles, you get to know them.
Your drums are the hardest thing to record.
Yeah.
But when you bring up in the A-Range, it's completely different.
Yeah, and part of the irony of that is that, as we were saying, a lot of this design was really kind of seat of the pants. I mean, I know, Joe, you've talked also to Malcolm Toft quite extensively, and I was really struck by how he's incredibly honest about the fact that he had no idea what the hell he was doing in designing these.
Credit.
No question.
Well, he discovered colored paint.
Yeah, but he was basically learning on the job.
Yeah.
Talking about those EQs for a minute, in the same way, they didn't know what would be a good frequency. They worked with the engineers there and did tests saying,
how's it
like
sound?
this mid-range, that mid-range.
Yeah.
And they ended up with their own select set of frequencies, which may be different than another board just for those reasons, but it was chosen for musical reasons by the engineers there.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of it really was designed on the basis of, well, what do you think? How does it sound? And I think, that is a lot different than the way APIs or Neves or any of these other consoles were designed, because they were designed by quote unquote real engineers with specs and meters. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Speaking to the A-Range specifically, Malcolm and Barry Porter were the 2 chief designers on that. And Barry was the smart man who put the circuits together. Malcolm had the ears, and Malcolm had the foresight to talk to the other engineers that were at Trident. So, I don't know about you, but if I'm talking to Roy Thomas Baker, and I'm talking to Ken Scott, when they tell me it doesn't sound right and it needs to do this, I'm going to listen, because they know what they're doing from an operational perspective. And that was one of the big things with that other console manufacturers have. And they sit there in their labs and play with all their test gear and go, oh, it does this and it's cool. And I can make it's not the same as being in the studio with engineers who spend their day, knowing how to do this stuff. One of the most unique things about A-Range in particular, and I've been asked this a few times, and my best description of it is it reminds me of a sizzle oil pickup. If you've ever heard of, Strat, that sounds completely different from Gibson. They're both guitars, but a Strat has a certain sonic character, particularly low end and high end, how it responds versus a humbucker. I've always referenced Neve consoles as like having a humbucker sound. You know, they're a little muffly on the top end, you know, they're kind of thick in the middle, but they're not the same as like an A-Range, which sounds like a single coil pickup.
Yeah.
That being said, being a single coil pickup, you are subject to all the laws of propagation of sound waves and so forth that a single coil pickup may have. So you have to have your grounding scheme correct, otherwise you'll get hums and buzzes and pop cyclics and all the little nuances that come with like having to Strat in the studio.
Don't turn this way.
Can't wait till my console 30 degrees.
Yeah, we used to get complaints every now and then from people who came in. They said, when I push the EQ in, I hear a pop. I said, well, don't do that while you record it. Yeah.
Doc, it hurts when I do this.
Or make sure you do it on the beat.
Well, the EQs are their own separate, you know, entities that
Yeah.
I've been fortunate to have long discussions with them to talk about. You know, because for me, straddling the creative side and the technical side, I remember having a talk with Malcolm. I'm like, you know, Malcolm, there's 123 degrees of phase shift when you push the EQs on an A-Range. And for a lot of people, those are horrible specs because you start getting comb filtering and you start to lose, you know, some of your response. You'll notice it mostly in the low end. And Malcolm's just like, well, how does it sound? I'm like, oh, it sounds great. He goes, then our discussion's done. We don't need to go into this anymore.
Exactly. That's how he designed the whole console.
Well, what's interesting, as you mentioned, Jonathan, there, that it is a feature. Because if you think about it, when the A-Range came out, the final format that most listeners had at their home was a vinyl record. And one of the things we know about vinyl is you really have to control your low end in order to fit X amount of minutes on one side of the record. So the fact that you lose some low end off the console when you have the EQs in, happy accident, that works out really well for the end format.
Like, very punchy.
Yes.
We mentioned 4 consoles, which might make you think that they're very common. If they're in one building, the two brothers had 4 consoles. In total, there were 13 of these full format A-Range desks. So the A-Range in Trident's Triads world is the top of the line. It's a flagship. It's the best that they ever made.
And it's hen's teeth.
Yeah, and so it's pretty rare. And there are people who have, you know, sampled software, etc. So you can get your hands on a version of it. But the console's still out there, and if some have gone to 5 or 6 different studios, some have remained in the same studio. That's rare. But they also made other boards too, down market ones, like a B-Range was similar and simultaneous, but not quite the flagship. And then there are other ones like TSM and the Series 80, and they're very good consoles. They share some ideas and some sonics with the originals, but still, even those people would admit to everybody that this is the top of the line.
Yeah.
And
And
the TSM on is all IC based.
yeah.
Yep.
Whereas like the A-Range and the B-Range is all discrete transistor based with transformers.
And at this point, several of the original A-Ranges have been lunchboxed, and I know that there's one in the UK at the Friary. There's one at East West. Obviously, Bruce, you still have yours, but there are not that many remaining. I think, Brian, you've been sort of documenting.
They're out there, and we're going to we were just talking, Tiffany and I, and we're talking about putting together a website, which has been my goal for a long time. Many years ago, I had 2 or 3 people I knew that had the A-Range, and they didn't know the history. So I said, that's easy. History is fun, and I dig into it for a hobby. Dumb idea, because I spent thousands of hours now going through where these boards came from, where they went. So we've tracked each of the desks, and they all still basically exist. Some have been sold in parts, but this console's still there, but they might have sold 4 channels or something. And some companies have even added their own channels, copied them exactly and made them larger. But
That's a scary
the concept is to put a web page together where each console has its own life. You see it go from studio to studio. And then this famous John Mellencamp record was done on this board, and this famous Rod Stewart was done on that board. It would be kind of nice to have that as an evolving and growing story. So we're seeking pictures, if you do find any or know of any, interesting pictures of the A-range consoles in situ in their original positions, or even now, we have them for each version of the studio. And of course, all the modern owners are happy to promote that this one at East West, or this one, there's a place called New Monkey Studios up near the 405 that has an A-range.
Yeah.
And that's used on Rush albums and things like that too. Each one has its history, its famous records. So that would be a great place to put all this information we've all been gathering and dump it in one place, and it can grow because it's a website, not a book, not an article.
Well, the
websites can
that
grow.
New Monkey came from Canada.
Yep.
Yes.
Les Studios.
Les
And
Studios.
there's one in a private studio in Nashville, I believe.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I had a phone call from my old Applebaum because there was a studio out in Aurora Hills called American.
That's
Yes.
right.
And he's like, they have an A-range and they're closing. Would you like to buy it? And then I called the owner and I said, hi, I'm a friend of my old Applebaum's, and they never called me back.
Oh, ow.
I'm not saying anything. I don't know what that means exactly. But that was to the 13 original consoles. I've always heard rumors, and maybe Adam, you can fill this in. I don't know. But there was a 14th console that wasn't a full size. It was in white, and apparently it lived in the transfer room. You know, also AKA mastering room over at Trident Studios.
Well, on the third floor, we had the copy room, and also like when you'd managed to get through being a T-boy before you could be put on sessions or maybe become a tape op, you had to be vetted by the whole building. So you had to go to tape copying for a month and just copy tapes. But you learn everything about tape, every speed, every alignment, the differences. So that was 1 month on your own, and there was a small little console in there. And then next door to that was the cutting room. Ray Staff, the mastering guy, great mastering guy, still doing it. And then you'd have to go into the mastering room and kind of like assist there for a month. And then you'd have to go into the maintenance department and help there. You'd learn a little bit, but basically everyone was vetting you. And at the end of it, there'd kind of like be a private meeting about whether you were the right kind of person that could be put on sessions. And it wasn't just about your ability or your ability to remember how many cups of tea and coffee or anything. It was about if they thought, that was important, but it was also, did they think that you could handle like the craziness that was going on in that period?
Essentially, it's the same today. You still have to prove that you're capable of being a good hang, and it's a lot more than just technical knowledge. But back to the console for a minute, I think it really would be interesting to find out where all of those went.
But we have it. It's written down. I have it.
You have
tons
all
of information.
Yeah.
But your question about that board, rumors of this board, that's not the only one. There are rumors of up to 4 A-range consoles at the Vatican. But
All right.
has been able to get information. However, almost simultaneously with the A-range, they were making the B-range. And I'm sure the Vatican can afford what they want to buy. But we never saw them. It's a rumor. They could have made a different version. It could have been a B-range. Same with the one in the other room. Would it need mic pre's if it's in a tape copying facility? No.
Yeah.
So they might have just made other consoles.
A version of it.
That's why we say that there are 13, because 13 were on the listing of what we built as full-size production consoles. Yeah?
Right, yeah. That's what I
Also,
heard.
it was very difficult to get technicians that understood that board in the U.S.
Well, and that's the thing too. You mentioned this, Bruce, also that every single one of them was different. You had different specifications and diagrams for each one of them, right?
Yeah, the changes are all minor. The A ranges, it's like not every Neumann mic sounds a little different.
Right. I know we had interchangeable. I remember that one of the routines that we had at Cherokee was we were recapping these modules, and we had several spares, and it was it was kind of like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. We always had some that we were working on, and when a module failed, it was time to swap one out, and that went into the next stack of maintenance on them. So they did get switched, from board to board.
Well, when Trident came to the U.S., when we got ours, within a couple of years, there were 3 more studios that got them, and then suddenly we got to get one of those. But they would get the technicians that were coming in, they'd looking at them, they said, what is this, a star ground? What are, this is no good. And they changed it. But I remember Barry Porter gave me a call and said, look, I don't know if you guys know this, but they're changing these things around and telling you this is the way to do it because it'll stop any clicks or pops. Who cares what you change the sound? I think it does. He said, don't change the grounding system, whatever you do. In fact, don't change anything in the A-range. There's nothing you can do that makes it better. It's just, it's there. So the other thing is, the reason you can do that is when you open up a Trident module and you open up an SSL module, it's like there's nothing in the Trident module. It's just
true.
Just point
Yeah,
to
it's
point.
true. There's almost nothing in them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the SSLs and things, there's layers of stuff. It scares me just to look at it.
Can we talk about Toby? You talked about their chief engineer, Toby,
Yeah.
was able to create more modules because they needed more channels. Instead of just buying a new board, why not expand the board that you have?
Oh,
Yeah.
Toby was brilliant. No question.
He was unbelievable. He
Yeah.
was. Yeah, no, he expanded it. And we also did something else to the A-range, which was a George Oxberger mod. But he was saying, you build a wall in front of it, and you're wondering why your speakers, the small speakers, don't sound like
Where the
this.
meters are sitting up there?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
ours is laid down flat. And that's the only change. People would come in and say, oh, it's not an A-range anymore. No, we just laid the thing down. And it made a huge difference. And like I'm saying, everybody that came into there had to come back. We probably had the biggest return clientele of anybody.
You changed the color too, by the way.
That's that's what.
Yeah. I mean,
that's what-
let's talk about the purple for a minute there.
Yeah.
Oh, the aubergine? Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
Aubergine.
Yeah.
aubergine.
Called it eggplant.
Yeah.
Oh, because it is eggplant. But Malcolm in typical Trident was like, hey, how inexpensive can we make things? And what I've been told from Malcolm that down the road from the studio was an auto body shop that fixed cars. And they needed the color for the console. And not only were they looking for a color, they were looking for something unique. And the auto body shop was having a closeout. They had gallons upon gallons of aubergine paint that he was able to get for like a couple bucks.
Yep.
And that's the only reason it's in purple, is they wanted to be unique and they got it for cheap.
That's true. One of the boards is in blue. They did a custom color because each one
We did that.
had slightly different, slightly different choices. While some were shaped in a linear fashion, some had an L-shaped corner to it.
Yeah.
So depending on the room and depending on the client, how many channels did you want? Setups like that. Basically, again, like based around a central concept, which is what API and Neve were doing too, but then some customization for each company. Yeah.
Yeah, but on the APIs and the needs and all of those, there's a coloration to the board that it would do to everything, and to me, that's not a good starting point. You need to hear what's coming in and input out of the speakers, and it needs to come back the same, and then you can make sensible changes that make a difference. And like I'm saying, mastering, when you go into mastering these things, people do almost nothing to them. You barely need anything. A dB at 50 and a dB at 10K. It's an A range.
Well, that's the big comment that almost anyone who has worked on an A range will say, is that it sounds like nothing. It's got the most, what you put in, you get out.
Yep.
And that is the beauty of that console, really.
And you could find individual pieces of gear like the Pultec full range equalizer. When I was talking to Barry Porter, he called. He was saying, I was thinking about that Pultec when I was doing this, and it's got the same bell curve to the EQ, which is just gorgeous. It's a wide curve. It's not a narrow curve. It's fixed. It doesn't change. And the overlap and the EQ points are just amazing. They're magnificent. And he was very important to us in the first year of having that console, because he called to tell us what to watch out for, because there weren't any in the country and no technicians knew them. So it was a problem, but Toby did. Well, he used to record there.
Yeah. Well, we have about 10 minutes remaining, so I want to open it up to any Q&A. We got a microphone over there. Go stand in front of it.
Microphone in the aisle, right here.
Right there, right behind you.
Challenge, Jonathan. Sure.
I remember, Brian, you mentioned something about when the A-range was developed, the original, I'm not sure if it was the light breed, and Was there something that they got a circuit out or a Reeboks or something?
Yeah, so again, as we were saying, they
right.
confessed to not knowing much. If you look in Wireless World magazine, which is basically, radio, hi-fi, TV, and so forth in England, there's a series on how to build a mixing board. On September, it's like how to make a mic pre. On November, it's how to make a summing channel and so forth. But one of the things they did was they were testing various units, and they felt that they really liked the front end of a Revox tape machine. The Studer Revox, 1/4-inch little portable machine that people like. They loved it. But what they did was they took that idea of a circuit. I don't know how accurate it is, but they liked it. They used a special transformer, which is part of the magic of those consoles, that they have very special transformer.
The Zut.
Yep. And then that's still a mystery. There's still people arguing over it, but the mystery might clear up soon. But then they took that and they used that concept as their starting point. And I'd be curious to know, because then the prices of these little Revox tape machines might go crazy, and you can buy a baby A-range and put your own transformers in it. But that was it. They were inspired by a little semi-pro tape machine. And that was the mic pre that became the most famous mic pre they ever made.
There's now such ones that was that. Because I built a limited edition mic pre so that on a pre. And we basically designed to see how I would to make a mic pre. And I made so you could switch in different input transformers on it. And I had, from working with Toto way back in the early 80s, I had a couple FlexiMix swaps. And they had that transformer. And I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure they were the same Zuts that were in the A-range.
Yeah, there is a small console designed for Queen to go on tour.
Yeah, right.
That is a very simplified mixer, but it uses the same fancy, cool, rare English transformers called Zut, Z-U-T-T.
Yep.
And then there's an O at the end. So some people call them Zutos, but that is the technical thing. Zut, O, means the type of Zut transformer.
I thought it was
and in the FlexiMix consoles, which you can still find fairly affordably, those transformers are inside it.
Yeah, so I'm sure those modules, why did I pull the transformer that's in the thing? I tried
No.
transformer attachable on the side.
It's going to be
And that's done.
let's out of it.
There's none of the Jetsons, the regular box, and went from Chandler sent me a whole bunch.
It's very different, isn't it? Yeah.
And it just had a magic to it. And so I spent a whole lot of time reverse engineering the thing. I couldn't get the physical bobbin kind of thing. I couldn't get that in that exact thing. But one thing noticeable, it had 30 feet.
A lift on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All transformers ring.
Air to it. And I just wondered, I know a lot of the modules are coming out that Al and I go, so it just makes a difference. And I thought, well, I don't know, man, well, trying that thing, it made a huge difference.
Yeah.
And it was tough, but I was able to get the windings right. I didn't even get that 30K deep, but it wasn't easy because you get this peak and then this just cave and then come back up. And I had to hand pick on the first 10 or maybe get 3 that had that magic. So yeah, so that's very.
Here's a good and bad story. So I became friends, communicated with Norman Sheffield. And then when he passed away, his son called me and said, I have a console I want to give to you. And I drove out to the English countryside and he gave me one of these FlexiMix consoles. And I said, oh, great. These are the ones that Queen used to use on tour. And he said, that's the Queen board.
Yeah.
My dad had it. It was in storage. And he gave me the FlexiMix. So I brought it back to LA and I had it restored and I got it and I had it in storage. Someone broke in and stole it.
Oh.
So somewhere out there is that board in the world.
That board, that specific FlexiMix was the one we had at Trident. And when we went 48 track, the posters, I think, for the first honest bit of marketing that Norman did was that it said Trident goes 46 track because 2 tracks were for code. And again, Trident was the first 48 track studio in Europe. And our mixing console, which was an A-range but configured differently, 40 channel, and now we've gone 48. So we used to have the FlexiMix set behind, and your first jobs as like an assistant on the sessions would be you'd be at the flexi mix, and we'd use it for like returns, reverb returns, effect returns, and all the important stuff would go up the main 40 channels. When your job as the newbie was to sit, and you were like the guy in the orchestra with one cymbal crash. You had one thing to do, which was maybe verse 2 bar 3 tambourine pan from left to right in the bar, and as it got closer and closer to that moment, your palms were getting sweaty, and like you couldn't grip the button, and you try not to drip sweat into like the modules. But the flexi mix, and it was it was a lower desk, and it really felt like you were at the family wedding of a mitzvah or something, and that you were having to sit with you were
Kids table.
Yeah, you were like 16 sitting with the 8-year-olds, with your knees that wouldn't fit underneath. It was quite a low thing. But then if you didn't screw it up and you managed to pan tambourine properly, then you eventually got to sit with the grown-ups at the big table in front of you. But that flexi mix, it was the Queen one, and pretty.
Now I'm even more sad that it's gone, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, I didn't mean to up it.
No, it's okay. It's out there somewhere.
I had gone to Stern was at a hot magnet,
Which is the Toto's demo/recording studio of their own. Yeah.
and it saw a lot of craziness. And some of them see lots of things at my house, and 20 years later, I was people to their first engineer to think. But one other thing I wanted to say, working at Cherokee from 1981 to 84, I'm not the ranges of Toby Foster, Bendo, with some of the best years of my life. I worked in a lot of studios, but my phone was doing me.
Amen.
Thank you, Bruce.
Amen. Thank you, Bruce.
We should also mention that George Martin declared it his favorite studio.
Can I tell you a quick Malcolm Toft story that
Sure.
just epitomizes Trident to write on everything, nearly. Our first Trident arrives, and they're putting it together, and we're going, wow, this is incredible. And it's really exciting. And then Malcolm is doing the installation and the thing. And so they open the boxes and start to plug the modules in. And Dee, my brother, and I were sitting watching doing this, and Dee says, Malcolm, why is channel 1 on the right?
Yeah.
On the monitors, channel 1 is where it's supposed to be, on the left, which when you think about this, from backwards, imagine panning drums. It's incredibly confusing, but what happened was we said, Malcolm, why did you do this? And Malcolm, in true Trident form, said, well, you never told us not to. He was right.
The key thing that you guys have all mentioned was that just making it up as you go along. And that was the Trident way. That's what all the engineers were just encouraged to do, to be individuals, make it up as you go along, find your own way of doing it. Obviously, there was incredible knowledge and methodology passed down from Ken and Roy Thomas Baker and Dave Henshall and Gus Dudgeon, the guys that were coming in and making the Genesis and the Elton John stuff. And there was a certain way to do things, but within that way was to try and find your own way, be different. And that was the kind of antithesis, like you were saying, to the Abbey Road way, where Jeff wasn't even allowed to place the mics himself. Trident was really fly by
That
the
was the
seat of
times.
pants.
That was really the times. That's what was happening musically.
Yeah, but you got to drive the wrong side of the road. So.
Yeah, so even when we're driving, we have to make it up as we go along.
Yeah, but really, I mean, musically, technically, that was really it was the times. That's what was happening musically. People were trying it. Flanging. I mean, a lot of these technologies, quote unquote, were really just happy accidents.
Yeah.
And that's the spirit of how music was created back then. And man, I'm grateful for it.
And one other thing that makes a huge difference with Tridents is when you have something you're adding distortion to all your guitars and everything like that, and your tracks are going to come out that way because everything you do that you're repeating is cumulative. And if it's only a little distortion, as you add more, it's more distortion. And with the Trident having this perfect sound and all the transients and everything you're playing, you hear the room that you're in. That's one of the reasons that when you fill up all, 48 tracks that you're working on, nothing degrades, nothing gets crushed. It's an amazing sounding thing, and it's like I said, it ruins you.
It's a place for us, ladies and gentlemen.
When I knew the console was going to be sold out, I was there from 78, the beginning till the end of 81 when Trident closed. Then it reopened towards the end of 83, but the lineage had been broken, the way of handing down the T-Voice system. So I'd moved to New York. They asked me to come back and put a new team together in the 80s, which included Flood, Alan Moulder, Spike Stent. And there was a second era of Trident in the 80s, which is phenomenal. But the last two things, I can't remember, it was maybe 85 that the console went to you. I can't, maybe earlier, I don't know.
It was 70s.
70s, oh, okay.
70,
Yeah, you already had 4 when I came in there in
Okay.
85.
So,
74? 75 is when we got it? I think so.
The first one.
Yeah.
right. So when I think it was mid 80s when one of them went, and I knew it was going, and I was just in a rush to get 2 records done before it went, and they were 2 records that essentially I did back to back. They launched my career, and the sound of those records was so instrumental.
You can recognize it.
Yeah.
Do you remember what those records were?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I was hoping someone would pick up on that. That's really good. The Cure, Close to Me. And then a band called the Blow Monkeys, a song called Digging Your Scene,
Oh, yeah.
which is the one that launched me as a producer. And the Cure obviously got a lot of attention for me, engineering. And they were done back to back. Last 2 things, records finished, console out the door.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to say, but we are out of time. So I want to thank my panelists, each of you, for putting this together and showing up down here in beautiful scenic Long Beach.
Yeah.
And thank you all for coming.
Second time's a charm.
I know, right?
Yeah, beautiful.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.